I haven't heard Kyle Kulinski's takes on any of this, so he might just be going full fucking batshit soy mode when he's talking about it. But if he's being honest about how he presents his videos, what he's saying so far is actually true. Trump was in power. Who the fuck knows? I don't actually know. Maybe Trump would have let NATO fall because Trump so arguably, from a Russian perspective, and this, I imagine this would be Putin's answer, right?
This is the language that I mean, though. Minor territorial acquisition.
Yeah, what does that mean?
In a charitable way.
Feels good squad. Oh, Vaush debating Kyle Kulinski on the Ukraine situation. I feel like I've outpaced
him intellectually. I just wish
we should have that role.
Look, this is 2 weeks ago.
I just want to say my only wish. I don't think there's anything wrong with telling Russia's side of the story. I wish you told Ukraine's, because in Ukraine's story, we are unambiguously not the devil. We are the
good guys.
Potential for salvation.
Oh my God, just say the good guys.
Ultimately, it's their country on the brink of being invaded. They're being talked about in this conversation, a buffer state, a pawn, only East Ukraine, whatever. But a lot of people live there. At the end of the day, they want us to protect them from Russia.
Wow, Vaush! Vaush! Based
Vaush! How's it going?
Not much, and also happy birthday. I didn't realize we'd be talking your birthday. I hope I'm not taking you away from anything.
No, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And no, I did a show today like normal, and you know, we had planned this a little bit in advance, so I was looking forward to it. And yeah, I mean, a birthday on a Monday is not the best day for a birthday to fall. Not that I'd be doing anything special anyway.
Yeah, I guess one of the benefits of you know, working for yourself, or at least doing your own work, is that any day can be a Saturday if you're strong enough to seize fate and do what you will.
That is true. Yes, that is true. So tell me, man. I watched your original video on Ukraine and Russia, and then I saw that you had one on me and Hassan. I didn't watch it because I didn't want to hurt my fifis before our talk. I was afraid to watch that, and I didn't want to come into the conversation with like 10 things in my mind where I'm like itching to get to, you know what I mean?
Yeah, so, I think that's probably fair and reasonable, especially since the way in which a person expresses criticisms is definitely going to differ in reacting to something as opposed to talking to the person. But yeah, I just wanted to talk to you about a few things. You know, not in like a hyper-confrontational way or anything, but I was curious about your perspective on some issues because... So when it comes to foreign policy stuff, I feel like, especially with issues like this, the left is split perfectly down the middle between people who get accused of being pawns of the U.S. State Department and people who get accused of being pawns of the Kremlin. And
totally.
And that's just like the eternal divide on issues like this, and the contrast has been especially evident here. As somebody firmly in the State Department camp, myself... and I think you get accused of being the Kremlin side more often. I felt like some of the perspectives you had on the situation felt propagandistic to me. And I was wondering what your rationale for some of them were.
Sure. So please elaborate. What are the things that you had issue with?
Yeah, elaborate, Vaush.
So there were a few things that I remember specifically, but I guess I want to approach it from your perspective, like the logic that you use to build into those ideas, as opposed to like, well, what do you mean with this one sentence, that one sentence? With regards to NATO expansion.
Wait, how do I build the floor triangle here?
I think that I and a lot of other people on the left recognize that NATO's a pretty bad institution for a few reasons.
Wait, that NATO's a bad institution?
Think that I and a lot of other people on the left recognize that NATO's a pretty bad institution
for
a few reasons, and that NATO expansion definitely carries its problems. But I feel like there's a strong line between criticism of NATO and accepting Russia's criticisms of NATO and the justifications that they derive from those criticisms. Like NATO's expansions warrant us forming a protective shell
of the
husk of the USSR to prevent NATO from getting close to our borders. Because that's kind of like the attitude that they're taking with the Ukraine situation. You know, like if NATO expands eastward, we have to protect ourselves. But I feel like these are on very different levels of severity, whereas NATO expansion is like a thing to be concerned about annexing neighboring countries is really, really bad. So I feel like they're so in separate categories of harm that even bringing up NATO expansion in relation to
Is
what's
a
happening
troll.
in Ukraine comes off kind of like a defense,
Yeah.
like you're holding water for Russia's excuses, you know?
Yeah, well, there are certain things that I consider like pretty obvious in the broader conversation about not just Russia, but if we're talking about Russia, China, or any authoritarian government.
Okay.
There are things that I think are obvious that, you know, I may not have brought up in the segment because they're so obvious, but I'll state some of the
Tell
obvious
us.
things right now. I mean, it goes without saying that, you know, Vladimir Putin is no leftist, to say the least. I mean, this is a guy who imprisons journalists. This is a guy who's virulently anti-gay.
Sounds pretty leftist so far. I don't know.
An open oligarchy.
These are
in a way
anti-leftist.
that's even above and beyond how I would describe the U.S. as an oligarchy, and I would describe the U.S. as an oligarchy.
Wow,
So,
brave.
Russia's really bad. The point in the video that I'm making is I'm trying to give people a full sense of what both the U.S. perspective is and the Russian perspective is. And when bringing up Russia's perspective, it's not necessarily to say that they're correct in their entire perspective. It's more to say, here's what their argument is, here's where they're coming from, because you simply, like, you don't hear on CNN or MSNBC or any mainstream outlets, you don't really hear anything about why they do some of the things that they do, or what, even if you say it's a bullshit justification or rationalization for what they're doing, it is, you know, one of the...
I haven't heard Kyle Kulinski's takes on any of this, so he might just be going full fucking batshit soy mode when he's talking about it. But if he's being honest about how he presents his videos, what he's saying so far is actually true. Usually when we present Russia and anything on the media, it's just they're just bad guys that are doing bad things because they're bad people, when that's kind of simplistic. Like, they have similar foreign policy ends that are close to the U.S. and that they want to make sure that there are people around them that have their country's interests at heart, and they prefer that to anything else, which isn't like too like crazy. I don't think there's anything necessarily horribly wrong with that. Yeah. But that we don't really hear about that take too often. It's usually just Russia bad.
Parts of the consideration. So if you heard what I said and thought, like, you know, that means Kyle saying it wouldn't be a crisis or it wouldn't be aggression for Russia to go into Ukraine, or when Russia did go into Crimea, or when Russia went into Georgia. No, I think those things are bad and wrong and condemnable. I just think in order to talk about the thing, we have to provide what we think are the perspectives of both sides in the disagreement.
Okay, I totally get that. And I understand the importance of acknowledging where Russia is coming at this from. But it felt like the language you were using went beyond like understanding their side, and went more towards kind of legitimizing theirs beyond a extent to which I think is justifiable. So, for example, calling for NATO to retreat back to its original post-World War II borders a reasonable ask, or like sort of saying that
Post-Cold War borders, not World War
sorry,
II. Okay.
sorry, my bad. Yeah, post-Cold War. Or saying that Eastern Ukraine, because of its ethnic composition, would be more amenable to Russian annexation than the rest of Ukraine. The perspective that I got while watching the video was that you were okay with essentially all of the former USSR being like a buffer state, like just an untouchable ring of nations that Russia has the ability to prey on at will without NATO or any Western entity either investing in or defending them.
So there are specific things that Russia has laid out in the negotiations that are going on behind the scenes with Anthony Blinken as like, hey, here's what we're asking for. And I bring it up in the video here. I'll quote it for you. Russia's demands include a legally binding halt to NATO's eastward expansion and a withdrawal of NATO troops from countries like Poland and Baltic nations that used to be aligned with or part of the Soviet Union. And the U.S.'s response to that has basically been, those are non-starters. We're not even going to consider any aspect of that. But what we will have a conversation about is military exercises. So, like, maybe we won't any longer do war games on the border in, I think it's Belarus, but don't quote me on that. I'll pull it up in a second if you don't recall which place it is that they just did war games.
In the area, at least, yeah.
Yeah. So they said, we'll have a conversation about military exercises are on the table in these negotiations if you want to have the negotiations, and our placement of missiles are on the table. So if there's, missiles that we have in some ally country that's close to yours that, we can maybe agree on, we'll move those out of here. So that's what the U.S. is saying. That's the U.S.'s line. My position on it is, and I'd be very curious to hear what your position on it is, there are certain things that I would say the U.S. should use as bargaining chips, like the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, for example, is one thing. I actually think that we should also use as leverage the idea of arming states in the region. But beyond that, I actually don't think those asks of Russia are unreasonable. I think that it is true that when the Soviet Union broke up, the whole idea of those post-Soviet states is that these are like buffer states between the West and Russia. And those states, in theory, were supposed to remain neutral. Now they're no longer neutral, or many of them have joined NATO. And I understand why, from the Russian perspective, they view this as aggression on the part of the West. So I guess, which things do you think are negotiable and which things do you think are not negotiable in trying to avoid some sort of catastrophe or World War III or some sort of a hot war?
I think the U.S. is in the right, at least with regards to negotiating chips. I don't think those were supposed to be buffer states. They're sovereign nations. And if they make the decision to align more with the West, which makes sense because we're wealthier and less autocratic than Russia is, at least, I think that's their right to. Likewise, with withdrawing NATO support. Withdrawing NATO support from Poland because Russia says so seems to me like a capitulation to authoritarianism that's like alongside some of the worst imperialism possible today. They want NATO there. Estonia, what have you, they want NATO there. It's their choice. Because they know that NATO, the only purpose NATO really serves anymore is to keep Russia's hands off a country. And I think that's fine, because Russia's pretty bad, honestly. These countries are scared of Russia, and I can't blame them for feeling that way, because Russia's one of the few countries these days who will just annex neighboring countries, which is wild. Like, that's very much not a thing that is supposed to happen anymore. It feels like so much of the expectations that have been levied on the former USSR satellite nations, Eastern Europe and what have you, are just a product of Russia's continuing antagonism and their unwillingness to get with the times. They're not strong enough to be an empire that can provide for their neighbors, the way China potentially could with their own geopolitical sphere of influence. Russia has to bully neighboring countries into submission, which, not to say the U.S. doesn't do that, but it's like the U.S. has the carrot and the stick. And in terms of NATO expansion, for the countries that get NATO, that's the carrot. They want us there. Russia just has a lot of sticks. I don't think we should pull out of NATO here. I think these sovereign nations have a right to defend themselves, but they're never going to do it on their own terms. They need our help for that.
So let me ask you this. What do you think would happen if, in theory, the U.S. said, you know what, we're going to sign a legally binding halt to NATO's eastward expansion, and we're going to withdraw NATO troops from Poland and Baltic nations that used to be part of the Soviet Union? Do you think that if the U.S. were to do that, that Putin would then in turn, actually try to invade and reconstitute the entire Soviet Union? Do you think he would go further than that and try to, go to other parts of Europe? Or do you think that that might actually lead to a situation where we're closer to peace and, it almost quashes the beef?
No, I think he would just try to rebuild the Soviet Union. I think that it probably wouldn't be full annexation of most of these territories, because that would be militarily unsustainable. It would probably be a decades-long process continuing from what he already does, which is he funds secessionist groups in neighboring countries. He uses his intel agencies to spread disinfo and propaganda. He does this globally, but he especially does this with right-wing groups in neighboring countries. He will manufacture crises and then become the only person who can solve it. He will make the population desperate for a strong man to solve the problems that were caused in part due to political instability he brought about, and then he will be their savior. But any country can do that, just as an abuser can convince the abused that they're dependent on them. I don't think that's Russia building allies. I just think that's Putin competently engaging in neocolonialism. I don't think he would stop, and I don't think that, I don't think Russia's apparent antagonism towards NATO has anything to do with a sincere anxiety over invasion. NATO would never invade Russia. It's like the idea.
Okay, one thing that I will say is that I think it's fair for Russia to be afraid of NATO slowly encroaching on its territory, because there are going to be times where there will be a conflict between Russian interests and U.S. interests, and having NATO right there, or NATO-aligned countries even, they don't necessarily have to be part of NATO, but just kind of sort of backed by NATO, officially or unofficially, I think it's a legitimate worry for Russia. I don't think that they're totally out of line being like, I don't know how I feel about this. Now, being a proud, wonderful American, I support the United States, but the idea that the U.S. and NATO sit here on your borders now, all willy-nilly, I think there's decent reason for Russia to not necessarily be huge fans of that.
Of like NATO being in Ukraine, it would never be a staging ground. Russia's a nuclear power. It was in terms of defensive action, I think that NATO's presence is just a rationale for outward expansion, but we've seen this with authoritarians before. Even absent a rationale, they'll still do it.
Hold on. Exactly. What is Destiny talking about? On your borders isn't Russian territory? Well, what if it was the case that Russia wanted to send planes somewhere and NATO countries, let's say a country starts shooting down Russian jets, right? Let's say Russia wants to ship jets somewhere or fly some jets somewhere, and a NATO country starts shooting down Russian jets. Well, if it's a normal country, maybe Russia retaliates. If it's a NATO country, you're just kind of fucked, right? What do? For anybody that doesn't understand the reference, Turkey did this. When Russia was sending jets down to help Syria to get rid of, who knows, probably ISIS and ISIS affiliates in northern Syria, Turkey just shot down 2 jets that were maybe in Turkish airspace. And Russia can't do fuck all to them. Turkey's a fucking NATO country. You're not going to do shit, right? These are issues where I can be sympathetic, at least, towards Russia being like, I don't know how I feel about NATO shit being right here on our borders. It's pretty sketchy, But
they'll just, they'll say other stuff. They'll manufacture other crises.
I agree that NATO wouldn't actually try to topple the Russian government, but I disagree in the sense that I think they actually think NATO would do that, because when you look at the West track record, I mean, we militarily support 73% of the world's dictatorships. We have 900 military bases all around the world. We did an illegal and offensive war in Iraq against a country that didn't attack us. And the laundry list. You talk about this stuff all the time, too. It goes on and on and on.
Maybe don't constantly violate airspace of different countries for a start. Okay, the conflicts are a little bit more complicated than that. How can you tell Russia, do not dare violate Turkish airspace, okay? Don't do that. That's illegitimate. While Turkey is moving its armies south into an ally's country. Is it still to this day that Turkey still owns parts of northern Syria? They just have troops sitting there, right? So it's like, okay, well, hold on, all right? I can't fly my shit to help my fucking ally over your airspace while you are literally sitting in my ally's fucking sovereign country with your own troops. That's bullshit, right? Not to say that I'm siding with Russia necessarily. I'm just saying I think it's important to look at the conflicts from both ends. It's not really like a good guy, bad guy, right or wrong. It does get complicated, and I think there are valid reasons why Russia can have interests in this particular area. Do you think NATO would take an actual aggressive stance against Russia itself or only against Russian allies? It's not about NATO taking an aggressive stance outwardly. It's just about like all the little proxy conflicts and shit that happen, right? And your ability to support those proxy conflicts and get the outcomes that you want from said proxy conflicts. Wait, those Russian jets, were they going to attack Turkish forces? Well, it depends on who you ask. If you ask Turkey, the Russian jets that were flying south to Syria were going to bomb and kill Turkish forces. If you ask the United States, the US will say that those Russian jets were flying over to murder FSA members, people that were fighting for independence of Syria. If you ask Syria and Russia, they'll say, well, hold on, those jets were flying over to bomb ISIS. So, I mean, like, it depends on who you ask. Like, there's like 17 different competing forces in this fucking region. You know, it's who were they going to bomb? I don't know, you know? And anybody like fucking more than 100 miles from the conflict doesn't know anything about any of these fucking groups or care about any of it anyway, so.
So even though I don't think NATO is looking to topple the Russian government, I think that from the Russian perspective, they genuinely fear the closer NATO gets to their border, the more they fear unstable, like NATO might actually do something. And to answer the question that I posed to you, look, maybe I'm naive and if I'm wrong, I'd be more than happy to admit I'm wrong if we were to try this experiment and I was incorrect, but
Let's take the inverse. What if those countries weren't in NATO? What would happen? Something even more No, what would happen is they would just get the shit bombed out of them. That's what would happen. This is one of the strong reasons why you can also argue that NATO is an effective nuclear war deterrent as well, right? Because if NATO didn't exist, then the next step is going to be, if you are a country that feels threatened by Russia, well, time to start rushing to nukes, because nukes aren't impossible to get. People know how to make them, right? It's just a matter of building the infrastructure up to do it. But if you're not going to have the United States defending you, and the only way it seems to guarantee that somebody won't invade your country and fuck with you, if you look at places like India, China, North Korea, well, it seems like having nuclear weapons is a really good way, or Pakistan, right? Is a really good way to keep people from fucking off. So then the rush becomes how many different satellite states now want to get their own nuclear development going because they feel like they don't have defense from NATO, right? It's just, there's a lot of shit going on.
I think that if we were to say some of your demands are legitimate, some of your demands are fair, so let's sign a deal to legally binding deal to halt NATO's expansion eastward, I think what would happen is either it would sort of squash the beef, or you'd get a situation sort of like similar to what you outlined, which is certain areas that Russia views as vital for geopolitical reasons. They might annex them, like Crimea. They literally took Crimea. They might go into eastern Ukraine and take that. But I think that the idea of expanding beyond that is politically impossible and not feasible. And even Vladimir Putin, as deeply authoritarian as he is, he knows there's really no prayer, no hope of reconstituting the old Soviet Union. And even if we take the worst case scenario of what I just described there, we then get into the deeper question, which is, I think the easier question, which is, what can we actually do about that? Like in the real world, what can we actually do about that? Because we don't have the international credibility or even the intent to sort of uphold human rights globally like we pretend to have. So since we're not like a fair arbiter of it, it seems like we're just sort of stuck in a paradox where there are no good answers.
Yeah, well, I acknowledge that the United States isn't great at worldwide diplomacy. It'd be pretty silly of me to believe that it was, but I don't know if that has anything to do with the logistics of this situation. NATO is pretty capable of handling itself, and of course, given the fact that Ukraine is in Europe, and Europe is essentially the strongest bastion of allies we have, we do have a
So it's more an issue that NATO's expansion will not just limit Russia's ability to influence post-Soviet states, but limit their ability to defend their own allies in a geopolitical conflict. I think basically, yeah, because a lot of the fighting today, I think, is done kind of through proxy. And it's like your goal is to always have like a bigger friend. I think that's kind of like your goal. You just want to have the biggest friend because it keeps people off of you, even if that friend doesn't fight. And when more people get bigger friends, then like little people can harass little people, but big people don't go after big people, and you get into these weird areas where like yeah, you never have direct conflicts between countries. Like Russia, hopefully, won't invade Ukraine. Russia isn't going to be firing weapons into Ukraine. But Russia might provide a little bit of training, a little bit of indirect support, a little bit of personnel to rebel groups in Ukraine to fight, right? The United States isn't going to put a military presence in Afghanistan to stop the Soviet Union, but maybe we can do a little bit of training, a little bit of help for some groups there to fuck with Soviets going into Afghanistan, right? The United States isn't going to invade Syria. Right? So like it's kind of like this endless series of these little proxy conflicts. But the thing is that like once somebody is officially a NATO country, those conflicts will no longer be they just won't be as effective, right? So say, for instance, Ukraine was an actual NATO member state, and they started to have these issues in Donbass, or whatever, I don't know how to pronounce it, the eastern area where the kind of these uprisings are happening, where arguably Russian weapons are being smuggled into. The United States would actually just send troops to help and say like, hey, we're shutting this down. Like we have NATO forces here, UN forces, we've got the United States Army, like we would just send them in directly. But since since Ukraine, don't call it the Ukraine, since Ukraine isn't like an official actual ally, we don't do that. We don't take that step, you know? But then also, arguably, from a Russian perspective, okay, and this, I imagine this would be Putin's answer, right? Putin might say something like, well, hold on. What if there were revolutionary forces inside of Ukraine that legitimately wanted to overthrow the current president, or wanted to stage a coup, or were just more democratically popular, and they wanted to have their own government, and maybe their leaders that they would elect to be more friendly to us in Russia. The United States, if Ukraine was a NATO member state, the US would send in troops to quash that. Look at how they've aligned with people across the Middle East, or look how they've aligned, people like Saddam Hussein, or look at what's happened in South America, If there was a revolution in Ukraine, and the leader that they backed was somebody that backed Putin, do you think that the United States would handle that? While the US was just recently trying to undermine, you could say Maduro, by supporting when Trump had the other guy that said, well, he was the real president over in the White House, Guaido, or whatever. Like, would you trust the U.S. to allow Ukraine to independently choose its own future if they wanted to forge a path ahead? Right? This would be Russia's argument to say, like, this is why Ukraine should remain an independent state, where we're all saying, yeah, they're independent, but we're all vying for what's going on in that country, Sorry. Okay. U.S. is based in Ukraine. Should be based, and fuck Russia. But Russia does have legitimate interests here that aren't just like they're the terrorist bad guys.
Proportionate interests in managing conflict in that region, as opposed to, say, the Middle East or, Northern Africa. But in terms of this, I guess a lot of these points feel like they're adjacent but not really relevant. Our track record of human rights abuses abroad is horrendous, but I don't know if it has anything to do with this. Essentially appeasement, because it is, right? Like, he'll take eastern Ukraine and stop is essentially appeasement. It may well be the case that he does just take eastern Ukraine and stop, but there are still a lot of people who live there.
Why is Russia's interest not aligned with the U.S.? That I don't understand. Why not join NATO? That's a good question. I don't know. Why can't everybody just get along and be friends and be happy? That's like a bigger question than me. I don't know. Why can't everybody why not everybody join NATO? Why not China and Russia and everybody? My guess is going to be is that we have some big oppositions in terms of economic, like who gets to decide what for oil, who gets to decide what for trade, what are the right answers for what regimes thrive in some areas. Like, I don't know. When you ask a question like, why can't Russia join NATO? What you're essentially saying is like, why can't we just have world peace? Why can't everybody get along? I don't know if I can give you like a good answer to, I don't know, other than just we have different interests. The U.S. answer would be that like Russia runs itself as a corrupt, autocratic regime that's almost fascist. Like, I mean, maybe even that it's massively corrupt. Putin is arguably one of the wealthiest people in the world. He spent the better part of the last decade consolidating all of the power, finances, everything. It's like the most oligarchical, autocratic government I think in the world. So why would they want to subject themselves to any type of democratic rule? Like, let's say Russia, quote unquote, joins NATO or comes to the rest of the world. The first thing the rest of the world is going to be saying, like, okay, what about all these human rights abuses? What about all of the financial corruption? What about all this shit? Like, why would right? But that's a very Western-centric answer, right? Not to say that I don't believe any of those things are true, but. But okay, sorry.
I mean, even if you're like removing NATO, moving them back to their...
You are delusional to think the U.S. is willing to send hundreds of thousands of soldiers to die in Estonia? The U.S. absolutely would. Do you think if it would be... Well, I can't imagine the United States allowing a NATO ally to fall. It would just NATO would be done. It would just be done, right? It would be about as unbelievable as the U.S. defaulting on the debt, right? Like I just can't imagine that. I don't know what would happen. That's like a catastrophic thing, you know. Now I say that, but if Trump was in power, who the fuck knows? I don't actually know. Maybe Trump would have let NATO fall because Trump didn't understand. I feel so arrogant saying this. It's hard to believe sometimes that Trump is as stupid as I think he is, but I just don't think Trump knew what NATO was or what it was about. I think Trump just thinks that NATO is like a group of countries that all like fund a military that goes around the world and does weird shit or something. I have no idea. I truly don't know. I don't know how smart or stupid Trump was. I had no idea.
Post-Cold War territories, it feels like it opens up a swath of the world, hundreds of millions of people who have no way of defending themselves against Russia, just sort of waiting. They're never going to be able to build a military to defend themselves, not against Russia, right? So it's really just like the hope that they play nice, because we couldn't intervene without NATO. We wouldn't have really a mechanism for securing, from preventing that expansion. I guess the real difference is that like the West and the East both want to expand into Eastern Europe. The West does it with incentives, and Russia does it with propaganda campaigns and annexation. Not to say we don't do our own propaganda campaigns, but NATO involvement is definitely preferable to like annexation, I would say. It just seems like a preferable system to defend.
Yeah, I think that, from their perspective, and just when you look at the world objectively, we don't have the track record to be able to lay a claim to being some sort of neutral arbiter in the conversation. So I think that makes it a lot more messy. And let me be clear, if Vladimir Putin takes eastern Ukraine, that is very bad. Like I'm not one of the people who says like, or who, number one, acts like that's not going to happen or it's not even in the realm of possibility. I think it's very likely that he'll do that. I think the question that I get stuck on is more, what can we actually feasibly do about that? And I think we need to lean in as much as we can to negotiation and diplomacy right now. And I don't think that doing that is akin to Neville Chamberlain appeasing Hitler, because I don't think Vladimir Putin is Hitler. I think Vladimir Putin is a domestic menace to his own people and an authoritarian, but there's a big difference between somebody with global domination ambitions and somebody who, in a very limited sense, even though it's absolutely terrible and negative, might have minor territorial expansion goals where, again, we're not even in a position to do anything about that without sparking a much worse conflict.
This is the language that I mean, though. Minor territorial acquisition.
Yeah, what does that mean?
Charitable way.
Well, I just mean that empirically, Vaush, because again, my sense is if we were to agree to the things that were laid out on the table by Russia, I genuinely think either it would squash the beef, number one, or worst case scenario, you'd see just like they did in Georgia, just like they did in Crimea, and right now with Eastern Ukraine. In other words, there's a limit to what he can do and what's politically feasible because of Europe being right there and the states that are already part of NATO.
But you want them to retreat all the way past Poland, which would give Russia a territory encompassing about 1/3 of a billion people, potentially with no threat of Western interference.
Well, so that's why, remember before I mentioned the thing about weapons, how that's not something I would take off the table. I mean, these are sovereign nations. So if these sovereign nations want the ability to protect themselves from any potential war with Russia, they absolutely have the right to do that. So one of the things that I would use as leverage in these negotiations is the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And the other thing I'd say is I don't care if Russia says there's a red line around arming these sovereign nations. Too bad. I mean, they're sovereign nations, and so they have the right to protect themselves. So,
we're arming the hell out of
is,
Ukraine right now, which I think is nice.
We are. Yeah, I mean, given the facts, given what happened in Georgia, and given what happened in Crimea, that's not unreasonable for Ukraine to want to be armed against a potential Russian invasion. But in fact, what we've seen is because of what happened in Crimea and because of what happened in Georgia, now you have a much stronger pro-Ukrainian government sentiment in Ukraine, much more so than before, because Putin's being so heavy-handed with what he's doing. There's a backlash effect, and that makes people want to run into the arms of the West even more.
That is true. Surge for NATO support surged in Ukraine after 2014. So I have to drill on a few of these points. You say that the U.S. isn't a neutral arbiter, which I agree with, but I don't think we have to be, because the Ukrainian people want NATO. They don't want to be invaded. And whatever pockets of like pro-Russian sentiment there are in Ukraine seem to be, at the very least, heavily coerced by a program of Russian-backed separatist movements and propaganda. So we're talking about the scales being tipped, and even with them being tipped, they're still heavily in the favor of Western interventionism through NATO occupation. And you talk about like what the Russian people think or what they fear. Keep in mind that after 9/11, the United States was convinced that Saddam Hussein was about to like fly over to America and start suplexing the rest of our Manhattan skyline. I'm not particularly concerned with what they think is going to happen, more so what will. And nobody will ever invade Russia as long as Russia is a nuclear power. Maybe involvement, possibly. Funding separatist movement, sure, that's game. But invasion just isn't going to happen. Which makes it seems like Russia's playing kind of the cry bully, where they're, through the perceived threat of being attacked, justifying actual attacks against their neighboring countries. And I don't know if they're going to stop with that, because Putin's no dummy. He knows he can't be invaded by, NATO. And that suggests to me that the motivation here isn't a sincere desire to establish a thin line of buffer states. It is outward conquest. Russia is one of, maybe at the moment, the only country engaging in the kind of open, outward, aggressive expansionism that it is. I don't know if anything else is comparable. Maybe some of the conflicts taking place in the Middle East in their own scale, or Sudan split. It is. China's doing their own thing, but China has other options on the table. I don't think this is minor. I think this is part of a deliberate strategy to push NATO influence out of sovereign nations that want NATO, so he has a larger playground to fuck with without worrying about the West interfering.
Based.
Yeah, so there's a few points I have in response to that. One of our disagreements is that I think Russia genuinely fears the West and genuinely fears NATO. You think it's more of the cry bully thing, where it's like, they don't really fear it. They know they're not going to get invaded, so they're just using that as the excuse to do what they want to do anyway. I take your point. It's possible, but I also understand why, from their perspective, they might actually fear NATO and might actually fear the West, because not just because of our record where we invade 17 countries before brunch.
Wait, I just to hold to.
Mm-hmm, yep.
We don't invade nuclear powers. And are we talking about what the Russian people fear or the government? It's not a democracy, really, right? So what the people will fear what they're told to fear. There's Russian state media that tells them what to fear. The government, I think, given the intel they have, couldn't reasonably believe NATO would ever engage in direct military boots on the ground action with them, the second largest nuclear power on Earth.
Well, it's true. Like, I think that, an actual invasion is very unlikely, and the Russian government knows that it's unlikely, but there are other ways in which the U.S. can fuck with them, and they're even on the conversation, in the conversation right now. Like, for example, cutting them off from the world banking system, for example, crippling sanctions against the country.
At this point, I mean, if they're going to do what they're doing, we're running out of options, right? We can't put boots on the ground, but...
So let's... We can come back to that, but I want to talk about there's a genuine paradox here that I don't know the answer to it. I don't know how to get around it. But Ukraine, so you're right, there's a pro-Western sentiment in Ukraine, I would say most of Ukraine. There are little parts that are more ethnically Russian where they don't feel that way, but that's a minor point. What do you do in a paradox where, and just go with me on this hypothetical, because I know you don't agree with my reading of this part of the situation, but what if we actually could achieve peace by agreeing to the things that Russia says? Like, hey, you need to do these things. And we go, you know what? Okay, we're going to do those things. What if that actually got us peace? But then you have Ukraine, democratically of their own volition, says, look, we don't care about your little deal here, which, may have gotten us peace, but we don't care about that. We're a sovereign nation. We want to be in NATO, regardless of the fact that this deal is working and it's leading to peace. How do you address that? Because on the one hand, look, we support democracy. If a sovereign nation decides it wants to do something, it has a right to do something. But what if, at the same time, them doing that then sparks a broader conflict? Like, wouldn't you agree that that's, just going with my logic for a second, that perhaps meeting these demands might actually lead to peace? What do you do in a paradox like that? Because I don't think there's any easy answer there. I think that it's nothing but,
it's not a paradox.
It's difficult no matter how you look at it.
Foreign
And then
policy,
beyond that,
which is
if
hard.
we agree that, hey, a sovereign nation has the right to democratically choose whatever they want on the international stage. Okay, well then what do we do in a situation where, say, Texas democratically decided we want to withdraw from the United States of America? Or the ethnically Russian parts of Ukraine decide, well, we want to withdraw from Ukraine and go and be part of Russia. You see what I'm saying? Like, there's no good answers here. It's nothing but paradoxes within paradoxes.
Well, I think, first of all, the only sovereign nation whose behavior is threatening peace in the region right now is, of course, Russia. Ukraine wasn't going to invade Russia. So in terms of, like, nations threatening peace in spite of the demands of every other country on Earth, they're the one doing that. And, like, trusting Russia when they say, hey, dude, just pull your defensive pact out of all the countries we used to brutally suppress under the USSR, it'll be fine. It'd be like listening to a wolf tell you that he'll stop raiding the hen coop as soon as you, like, get rid of the locks. I don't know.
That's why I asked you to go with my hypothetical.
Well,
I
mean, with the hypothetical, I mean, it would be like, what if Hitler stopped after the Sudetenland, right? I mean, in the hypothetical,
I just don't agree with those analogies, Vaush. I just don't agree with them.
In the hypothetical, you're presupposing a set of conditions that I don't think is likely to happen. If
Okay,
that
fair
did
enough.
happen,
That's your answer.
If that did happen, if Russia, and I don't know why, because I don't think Russia's really threatened by NATO expansion. The only thing it denies them is the ability to just invade neighboring countries. But if they actually did just stop, if all this really is just a reflexive, fear of NATO's expansion, I guess I would still take issue with the fact that what we needed for peace in our time was to undermine the sovereignty of Eastern European nations in order to appease the paranoia of the Russian government. That would be the best case scenario. Like, I guess we're normalizing the idea that big countries get to just decide who small countries are, buddies with or have defensive pacts with. Like, I would take issue with the United States saying, like, oh, sorry, Mexico, you can't be part of this social democratic, like, Latin American alliance or whatever, with a defensive pact. Because the only reason we would ever not want that would be if we had plans to invade Mexico, which I hope we don't do anytime in the near future. But I guess at the end of the day, I mean, what I want is peace, and the great peace breaker here seems to be Russia. But I don't think that kowtowing to the demands that don't seem to be motivated by actual geopolitical threats will change anything. I feel like the only thing we can do at this point is starve Russia out. We're wealthier than them by metrics. I mean, ally with all the countries in their periphery, sanction, sanction their leaders, cripple their economy, wait for them to bleed out, and then when they're ready to play ball, they can be a nice, compliant country.
I mean, but there's a lot of civilians that get hurt in that scenario.
In eastern Ukraine as well, yeah. But if they're going to be like that...
if we do the sanctions on Russia, is what I'm saying, that would hurt a lot of civilians.
Not
That's what sanctions do.
Their missile strikes would hurt eastern Ukrainians, right? Again, keep in mind, this isn't out of spite. If they're going to keep year after year invading and annexing neighboring countries, the way we used to solve this was by going in there and killing people who made decisions in their leadership. But they're a nuclear power. We can't do that. So I think we have to find a way of dealing with them. I don't think that they're just going to stop. I think they know that they're a nuclear power. They know we can't do anything direct, and they take advantage of that by commanding far more authority than their economy, fairly would allow otherwise.
I think that our main disagreements come down to whether or not the asks of Russia in this negotiation are reasonable and what the ultimate goal is of Russia. I think that you genuinely seem to believe it is somewhat analogous to like Hitler, right? In Germany?
Yeah, well, keep in mind, I don't think that Hitler was exceptional. The idea of autocratic nation leaders like getting away with territorial acquisition is something that was the norm for all of human history. World War II was only, 80 years ago? Russia gets away with more than it would be able to otherwise because it's a nuclear power. But the idea of an autocrat, like relentlessly expanding, conquering territories, making their neighbors miserable, I don't think that's like a super unique or special thing. I just think it's more difficult these days because the countries that have the armies capable of fielding that kind of destruction usually are bordering nuclear countries. So we can't do that anymore. They can, because since Russia was the inheritor state for the USSR, they got to keep all the nukes, even though they were stationed in countries all across Eastern Europe and the Warsaw Pact. Now that they're not the inheritor states, they got nothing. So now Poland and all of Eastern Europe have no way of defending themselves against invasion. Not to say nuclear proliferation is a good thing, but it's a good deterrent, if nothing else. And Russia gets to keep all the big boy bombs. So I don't think it's exceptional, the idea that they would invade their neighbors, you know?
Well, I think Hitler was exceptional in the sense that he had genuine world domination goals. And so I think that puts him not in a league of his own, but among even a minority percentage of even authoritarians. So in other words, I think as terrible as Vladimir Putin is, and he's terrible, I don't think he's analogous to Hitler in that sense. So I think to look at the actions of the Russian government as if they're...
What about Alexander the Great or Genghis Khan? We don't have to go to Hitler.
That's why I said a minority of authoritarians. I think that most authoritarians are interested in being authoritarian, but they're fine with certain territorial acquisition that does not encompass the entire globe.
I mean, I don't know.
It's not a defense. I'm not defending. I'm just trying to inject some nuance into the conversation because I don't think the comparisons of Putin to Hitler. I think that would make reasonable people think that then almost anything is okay in trying to deal with him. And in fact, if people really believe that, it's like, why even bother with diplomacy? Why even bother with negotiations? I mean, we should be deploying the troops right this very second.
Well, that would trigger World War III, right? I mean, keep in mind...
Okay, this goes on for an hour and a half longer. There's got to be something else to watch. I'm good on this one.